it just seems like he never got a break. I was very happy I was able to spend every second with him that I could.
Eddie Van Halen revolutionized rock music with his legendary guitar techniques and created anthems that defined generations. But on October 6, 2020, the world lost this musical genius at age 65. His son Wolfgang was there, holding his father's hand during those final moments. What Wolfgang revealed about Eddie's last days shocked the music world, from desperate midnight recording sessions to heartbreaking final conversations. The guitar legend spent his final weeks creating music that may never be released, pushing his failing body to its limits. What did Eddie whisper to Wolfgang in his final hours? And why did he refuse to stop playing guitar even when doctors begged him to rest? Eddie Van Halen was born January 26, 1955, in Amsterdam, Netherlands, to Jan Van Halen, a Dutch clarinetist, and Eugenia Van Beers. In 1962, the family immigrated to Pasadena, California, with little more than musical instruments and dreams. Jan worked as a janitor while playing weekend gigs, teaching young Eddie that music could transcend any hardship. Eddie's musical journey began with classical piano at age 6. His strict teacher demanded technical perfection, but Eddie's restless spirit craved something more explosive. When rock music invaded his world in the late 1960s, everything changed. He initially wanted drums, but his older brother Alex claimed the kit first. This twist of fate forced Eddie to pick up the guitar instead. The decision altered rock history forever. Eddie taught himself by listening to Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page, but he refused to merely copy their techniques. His bedroom became a laboratory where he dissected amplifiers, modified guitars, and created sounds that had never existed before. Hours turned into days of obsessive practice, missing meals and social events to perfect his craft. By 1972, Eddie and Alex formed Genesis, later renamed Van Halen. They played backyard parties around Pasadena, slowly building a reputation centered on Eddie's revolutionary guitar work. His innovations included two-handed tapping, custom-built Frankenstrat guitars, and amplifier modifications that created entirely new sonic textures. The young guitarist's perfectionism was already consuming him. He practiced 8 to 10 hours daily, often forgetting to eat or sleep. His parents worried about his isolation, but couldn't deny the extraordinary sounds emerging from his room. This obsessive dedication would define Eddie's entire career, ultimately driving him to create music until his final breath. Eddie's early guitar experiments were revolutionary. He would heat guitar picks with lighters to change their flexibility, modify tremolo systems with motorcycle springs, and rewire amplifiers to create feedback loops that produced otherworldly sounds. His neighbors complained about the noise, but Eddie's sonic explorations were creating the foundation for an entirely new approach to rock guitar. In 1974, Van Halen recruited vocalist David Lee Roth and bassist Michael Anthony, completing the lineup that would conquer the world. Eddie's guitar techniques were revolutionary: two-handed tapping, dive bombs, and harmonics that screamed like fighter jets. His homemade Frankenstrat guitar, painted with distinctive black and white stripes, became as iconic as the man himself. Their breakthrough came in 1977 at the Starwood Club in West Hollywood. Kiss bassist Gene Simmons witnessed Eddie's performance and was immediately stunned by his revolutionary approach. Simmons financed their demo recordings and helped secure a deal with Warner Brothers Records worth $1.5 million. Enormous money for an unknown band in 1977. The self-titled debut album, released February 10, 1978, exploded onto the rock scene like a sonic bomb. Eddie's guitar solo, Eruption, became the track that changed everything. The 102-second instrumental showcase demonstrated techniques that seemed impossible to most guitarists. Rolling Stone later called it the most influential guitar solo in rock history. Success was immediate and overwhelming. The album reached number 19 on the Billboard 200 and eventually sold over 10 million copies. Songs like Runnin' with the Devil and Jamie's Cryin' dominated radio waves. Eddie's guitar work anchored every track, but his innovative songwriting approach truly set Van Halen apart from their peers. But with success came pressures that would eventually destroy Eddie's health. Constant touring, recording deadlines, and media attention created stress he initially managed through alcohol. The seeds of his future health problems were being planted even as he achieved his greatest triumphs. What nobody realized was that Eddie's perfectionist nature would eventually drive him to work until his dying day. The band's live performances became legendary spectacles. Eddie's guitar solos would stop shows cold, with audiences witnessing techniques that seemed to defy physics. His stage presence was electric, bouncing around with childlike enthusiasm while producing sounds that made grown men weep. These performances established Van Halen as the ultimate live rock experience. Throughout the 1980s, Van Halen dominated rock music with a string of multi-platinum albums: Van Halen II in 1979, Women and Children First in 1980, Fair Warning in 1981, and Diver Down in 1982 established them as one of history's most successful rock bands. Eddie's guitar innovations continued evolving, incorporating new techniques that influenced countless musicians worldwide. Their commercial peak came with 1984, released January 9th, 1984. The album featured the synthesizer-driven hit Jump, which reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. Eddie's decision to incorporate keyboards alongside guitar demonstrated his willingness to experiment with new sounds. The album sold over 10 million copies and established Van Halen as a global phenomenon. Eddie's personal life flourished during this period. In 1981, he married actress Valerie Bertinelli in a union that captivated the entertainment world. The rock guitar god and television sweetheart seemed perfect together. They purchased a sprawling Malibu estate where Eddie built an elaborate home studio that became his creative sanctuary. The couple's son, Wolfgang Christoph Van Halen, was born March 16, 1991, bringing new meaning to Eddie's existence. From the moment Wolfgang could walk, he was surrounded by music. Eddie would carry his infant son into the studio, where Wolfgang slept peacefully amid recording chaos. The baby's presence seemed to calm Eddie's notorious perfectionism, at least temporarily. Eddie's approach to fatherhood was hands-on and nurturing. Despite Van Halen's demanding schedule, he attended school events, coached Little League games, and spent countless hours jamming with Wolfgang in their home studio. Music became their primary language of communication, but Eddie's inner demons were already surfacing, setting the stage for struggles that would define his later years. The 1980s also saw Eddie's guitar techniques become standard elements of rock music. His two-handed tapping was copied by thousands of guitarists, his harmonic squeals became signature sounds, and his approach to amplifier modification influenced entire generations of musicians. Guitar magazines featured Eddie on covers regularly, analyzing his techniques and equipment choices. The 1990s brought significant upheaval to Van Halen's dynamics. David Lee Roth left in 1985, replaced by Sammy Hagar, who brought different vocal styles and songwriting approaches. While the Van Hagar era produced successful albums like 5150 in 1986 and For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge in 1991, internal tensions strained the band's unity. Eddie's relationship with alcohol and prescription medications became increasingly problematic. The pressure of maintaining Van Halen's success, combined with his perfectionist tendencies, created a toxic cycle of stress and substance abuse. He began missing rehearsals, arriving late to sessions, and displaying erratic behavior that deeply concerned his family. Wolfgang, now old enough to understand his father's struggles, watched helplessly as Eddie's health deteriorated. The young boy often discovered his father passed out in the studio, surrounded by guitars and empty bottles. These traumatic experiences would later inform Wolfgang's deep understanding of his father's creative process and personal demons. Eddie and Valerie's marriage crumbled under the pressure. Their 2007 divorce after 26 years was amicable, but marked the beginning of Eddie's darkest period. His struggles with addiction intensified, and his health began deteriorating visibly. Wolfgang, then 16, found himself watching his father's decline while desperately trying to maintain their close relationship. Despite these challenges, Eddie continued creating music with obsessive intensity. His home studio became a refuge where he could escape personal problems and focus solely on his art. He would disappear for days, emerging with new compositions that showcased his undiminished talent. This pattern of using music as therapy would intensify dramatically in his final years. The addiction struggles were particularly devastating because they affected Eddie's guitar playing. His legendary precision became inconsistent, his timing suffered, and his physical stamina decreased significantly. Yet even in his darkest moments, Eddie's musical genius remained intact, creating some of his most emotionally powerful compositions during this troubled period. In 2000, Eddie Van Halen received devastating news that would change everything: tongue cancer. The diagnosis came after months of mysterious symptoms, persistent sore throat, difficulty swallowing, and unexplained weight loss. Doctors attributed the cancer to Eddie's decades of heavy smoking and drinking. habits that had sustained him through years of relentless touring. Eddie's response was characteristic. He attacked the disease with the same intensity he brought to music. He underwent surgery to remove part of his tongue, followed by brutal radiation therapy. The treatments were agonizing, affecting his speech and making guitar playing painful for extended periods. But Eddie refused to let cancer silence his music. The cancer battle coincided with increasing Van Halen tensions. The band reunited with David Lee Roth for a 2007 tour, but Eddie's health struggles created additional instability. He missed rehearsals for medical appointments, and his guitar playing, while still masterful, showed signs of the physical toll his treatments were taking. Wolfgang witnessed his father's battle while navigating his own teenage challenges. He was in high school, trying to experience normal adolescent life while his father underwent chemotherapy and radiation. The experience bonded them closer, as Wolfgang became Eddie's primary source of emotional support during treatment's darkest periods. Eddie's cancer went into remission in 2002, but victory felt temporary. He lived with constant fear of the disease's return, anxiety that contributed to his continued struggles with alcohol and prescription drugs. The rock god who had seemed invincible was learning harsh lessons about mortality and life's fragility, but his greatest battle was still ahead. The cancer treatment forced Eddie to confront his mortality for the first time. He began writing letters to Wolfgang, recording video messages, and creating musical compositions that served as potential final statements. These works would become increasingly important as his health continued declining over the following 2 decades. In 2006, Eddie Van Halen made a decision that would forever change his relationship with Wolfgang. He asked his 15-year-old son to replace Michael Anthony as Van Halen's bassist. The move was controversial, with critics questioning whether nepotism was driving the decision. But Eddie had watched Wolfgang develop into a skilled musician who understood Van Halen's music better than anyone. Wolfgang's integration was gradual and carefully managed. He spent months rehearsing with Eddie and Alex, learning not just bass parts, but the subtle dynamics that made Van Halen's music work. His youth brought fresh energy, while his deep understanding of his father's musical vision maintained artistic continuity. The first tours, featuring Wolfgang, were profoundly emotional for Eddie. Seeing his son on stage, contributing to music that had defined his life, represented the ultimate validation of his legacy. Critics who initially dismissed Wolfgang as a nepotism hire were quickly converted. His bass playing was solid and creative, his backing vocals adding new dimensions to classic songs. The experience deepened Wolfgang's understanding of his father's artistic process. He watched Eddie craft guitar parts with obsessive attention to detail, witnessed his studio perfectionism, and learned to appreciate the emotional investment Eddie put into every note. These lessons would prove invaluable as Wolfgang prepared for his own solo career. Wolfgang later revealed that playing with his father provided unprecedented insight into Eddie's creative mind. He saw how Eddie would spend hours perfecting a single phrase, experimenting with amp settings until finding the exact sound he heard in his head. This perfectionism had driven Eddie's greatest achievements, but was becoming an obsession that would define his final years. The father-son dynamic on stage was magical. Eddie's face would light up when Wolfgang hit a particularly difficult bass line perfectly, and Wolfgang's smile when his father launched into a legendary guitar solo was pure joy. These moments created some of Van Halen's most memorable live performances. By 2019, Eddie Van Halen knew time was running out. His cancer had returned with vengeance, metastasizing from his tongue to his throat and eventually his lungs. Despite aggressive treatments at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, doctors were running out of options. The prognosis was grim. Months, not years, remaining. Eddie's response was throwing himself into music with desperate intensity, as if he could outrun death by creating one more perfect guitar solo. Wolfgang revealed that his father's final months were spent in almost constant musical activity. Eddie converted his home studio into a 24-hour creative laboratory where he worked on new compositions, revised old songs, and experimented with sounds that existed nowhere else. The final recordings Eddie made were deeply personal, featuring guitar work Wolfgang described as the most emotional and beautiful music he ever created. These weren't meant for commercial release. They were Eddie's final artistic statements, his way of processing mortality through the language he knew best. Some sessions lasted 12 hours, with Eddie playing until his fingers bled. Wolfgang was present for many final recording sessions, serving as both technical assistant and emotional support. He watched his father push his weakening body beyond its limits, creating music that seemed to emerge from some supernatural source. Eddie's perfectionism remained intact even as his health failed, playing the same passage dozens of times, seeking the exact emotional tone he wanted. The studio sessions became therapy for both father and son. They spent hours talking between takes, with Eddie sharing career stories, offering music business advice, and expressing hopes for Wolfgang's future. These conversations became Wolfgang's most treasured memories of his father. Eddie's final compositions were revolutionary even by his standards. Wolfgang described hearing guitar techniques that seemed impossible, emotional expressions that transcended normal musical boundaries. These recordings remain private, representing Eddie's most intimate artistic statements. Wolfgang Van Halen's most painful revelations concerned his final conversations with Eddie. As his condition deteriorated in September 2020, Eddie became increasingly focused on ensuring Wolfgang was prepared for life without him. These conversations were raw, emotional, and sometimes difficult for Wolfgang to bear. Eddie's primary concern was Wolfgang's musical future. He wanted to ensure his son understood he didn't have to carry on the Van Halen legacy if it didn't fulfill him artistically. "Make your own music," Eddie repeatedly told Wolfgang. "Don't let anyone trap you in my shadow." The advice was generous but heartbreaking, coming from a father who knew he wouldn't be around much longer. Wolfgang revealed that Eddie expressed deep regret about his past addiction struggles and their impact on the family. He apologized repeatedly for the pain his diseases had caused, even though Wolfgang assured him forgiveness wasn't necessary. These conversations helped both father and son find peace with their relationship's complicated history. The final weeks were marked by increasing physical pain, but Eddie's mental clarity remained sharp. He continued offering musical advice, sharing career stories, and expressing pride in Wolfgang's achievements. One of Eddie's last coherent statements was about music's power to connect people across time and space. He told Wolfgang that every time someone played a Van Halen song, part of him would still be alive. Eddie also spoke about his unreleased final recordings, telling Wolfgang they contained his most honest musical expressions. He wasn't sure if they should ever be released, but wanted Wolfgang to have them as a record of his final creative period. These tapes remain in Wolfgang's possession, a private treasure that may never be shared with the world. These final conversations revealed Eddie's deepest fears and greatest hopes. He worried about Wolfgang's ability to handle the music industry's pressures, expressed concern about his own legacy, and shared wisdom accumulated over decades of musical experience. The talks were emotionally exhausting but ultimately healing for both father and son. October 6, 2020, began like many others during Eddie Van Halen's final weeks. Wolfgang was at his father's bedside at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica, where Eddie had been admitted for treatment of his advancing cancer. The medical team had exhausted all options, and Eddie's body was finally succumbing to the disease he'd fought for 20 years. Wolfgang described the final hours as peaceful but profound. Eddie drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally opening his eyes to look at his son with what Wolfgang interpreted as gratitude and love. There were no dramatic final words or theatrical gestures, just a father and son sharing their last moments together in quiet dignity. The end came at 1:17 p.m., with Wolfgang holding his father's hand. Eddie's breathing simply stopped, and the man who had revolutionized rock music slipped away peacefully. Wolfgang later said that despite his overwhelming grief, he felt grateful to have been present for his father's final moments, providing comfort during the transition. Wolfgang's immediate reaction was complex, profound sadness mixed with relief that his father's suffering had ended. Eddie had been in significant pain during his final weeks, and Wolfgang knew death had brought peace. The hospital staff showed extraordinary compassion during those final hours, giving Wolfgang privacy to say goodbye. Wolfgang's first act after his father's death was calling his mother, Valerie, who had remained close to Eddie despite their divorce. Together, they began notifying family, friends, and eventually the world that a musical legend had passed away. The announcement came via Wolfgang's social media accounts, sharing a simple but heartfelt message about losing his father and best friend. The death announcement sent shockwaves through the music world. Tributes poured in from fellow musicians, celebrities, and fans worldwide. But for Wolfgang, the public mourning was secondary to his private grief, the loss of the man who had been both his father and his greatest musical inspiration. In the months following Eddie Van Halen's death, Wolfgang has honored his father's legacy while establishing his own musical identity. Through his revelations about Eddie's final days, we understand that the guitar god's greatest achievement wasn't any particular song or technique, but the love and musical legacy he passed on to his son. Wolfgang's words provide closure while preserving the dignity of a legend's final moments. The music lives on, carried forward by a son who learned not just guitar techniques, but the deeper meaning of artistic expression from one of history's greatest musicians. Thanks for watching. Click here to check another video and make sure to subscribe to our channel.